probably the first episode I've seen that would actually qualify as not good. Even amongst season 1. Generally, there was some decent amount of enjoyment to be had in basically every episode, but this one really falls flat. And now, I guess technically that's not true. There was also the episode I can't remember the name of, where there's the thing that's taking over the person and Sinclair has to talk it down. You know, the biological weapon thing. So I guess we're at 2 episodes that I don't exactly care for. But yeah, this one, that one had some elements of just, huh? This one felt boring. This is so that's why I say this was the first. This is the first Babylon 5 episode I sat down and was just kind of disengaged from the episode. When I really thought about it, I could come up with stuff to think about during the episode, but the episode rarely presented that. It's also a funny episode because my friend Pax, who watched this series about a year ago or 2, something like that, for the first time, I asked him about halfway through, you know, what do you think so far? And he says, man, I hate that Captain Maynard. And I'm like, who? Like, I actually couldn't think of who he was talking about at first because he's such a forgettable character. The captain from this episode. And he talked about how he absolutely despised his actor and how he was just bland and disinteresting the whole time. And I'm like, okay, I had to look it up to figure out who the heck he was talking about. Having rewatched that, I have to absolutely agree. The guy who plays Maynard is just so... I'm acting! That it's kind of painful. Kind of adds to that whole bland side of things. And just as another way of emphasizing the failure of this episode, I feel like the entire subplot with the food plan and Garibaldi's father should have more emotional impact than it does. One thing that I've been pointing out many, many times as we've gone through here is Babylon 5's propensity for showing the human down-to-earth element, you know, down in the trenches. Here's just a normal, everyday, day-in-the-life thing. They've been doing that for a while now. And I feel like that's what this was an attempt to do, you know, showing them being upset about the food plan thing and the interactions between Franklin and his character, excuse me. And of course, I actually thought Franklin was going to try and sell the food plan to Delenn for a moment. I mean, she's part human, technically, kind of now, anyways. But no, the one that... And then, of course, there's that great speech that Garibaldi gives about this, and I'm not going to even try to pronounce it, this Italian dish. I've actually eaten it. It's quite good. This Italian dish, which should have had more weight to it. Now, Garibaldi does a decent job with explaining, you know, in his simple human manner, this was my dad's way of saying, I love you. Like, he gives this whole speech, but that's what he's saying. This was my dad's way of saying, I love you. And at any cost, and he does show throughout the episode how much he's willing to spend, what lengths he's willing to go to make this happen, because it's that important to him personally. We know for a fact Garibaldi is a very sentimental individual. It's one of the reasons why the betrayal of his aide hurt him so badly. You know, reasons of logic don't really overwhelm reasons of feeling and emotion. Much more of an emotional character. Indeed, the chaotic good thing I mentioned some time ago. So it makes sense that he would have such an attachment to such a seemingly silly ritual. And I have to admit, I probably find myself more inclined towards giving him credence on that than I otherwise would be, because I'm the same way. I tend to put a lot of sentimentality into silly little things like that. It was a nice touch, but for the rest of it, just felt like it fell flat on its face, even though it shouldn't have. And the entire time, they go into hyperspace. The Cortez goes into hyperspace, and God, I'm so tired. They go into hyperspace, and there's an explosion. Okay. And the captain is such a bad actor, and he's like trying to act like he's upset, but he's just comes across as if he's yelling. And I feel like the other people were trying to act around him. Like, I actually felt like some of the extras playing the crew of the Cortez were having trouble acting around his acting that he was doing, you know? Now, I mean, Lord knows that I'm not one to talk here. We've all been guilty of acting anytime we've tried that, right? I mean, it's just not common. In fact, most actors, when they're first starting out, whether it be in theater or television or movies, generally are more actors than they are actors. And that's normal, but that doesn't change the fact that this guy was just kind of bad. It really sapped a lot of the drama out of the scenes. The whole time I just felt myself thinking, this doesn't feel threatening at all, until I thought about it. Now that's the reason I say there is something interesting of thinking about, and that's the hyperspace in general. This is probably the first time they really start discussing hyperspace and its nature in the series. So this episode does do some good world building. We know that there are explorer ships which go out on the rim for many, many years' journeys and actually build jump gates as they go in order to facilitate future travel. That actually makes perfect sense to me. It's a type of faster-than-light travel I've always found fascinating and I've employed in my own setting several times. The idea that you can zip around instantly if you have an exit point and an entry point. In other words, someone needs to go there the slow way first to build that exit point. In fact, in the Star Trek show that I had pitched to CBS some time ago, one of the major plot points of the first 4 seasons was that there was a jump gate of a similar nature which was being built to facilitate more or less an artificial wormhole kind of a situation in order to, but they had to get there slowly the first time, and then they had to build it, and then they had to keep it secret, and then they had to defend it when the Federation found out about it, all this fun stuff. Anyways, so I like that concept, and hyperspace itself is something that they also flesh out a bit here. The idea of it being this dangerous hellscape is something that we've already kind of seen a few times, but in this type, what we see here is that hyperspace is more like still water. Something I've always found quietly terrifying. The idea that you're on an ocean and you're on a ship, so you're fine, except you're in doldrums. So, hang on just a second. I just got a message from my dear sister. So, doldrums, the idea that you're out on the water and there's no wind and there's no current. Or I shouldn't say there's no current, that's actually inaccurate, but there's no significant current. So you can't drive, in other words. You have no control. You're safe, but you're trapped in safety. It's one of those quietly horrifying situations where you're basically in such a calm, normal, non-threatening seeming situation that will kill you if things don't go well, because you could just drift and drift until you starve to death or dehydrate to death on the ocean. And that has happened. And it's like, that's why I call it quietly terrifying. You know, a T-Rex who's bearing down on you, that's terrifying. Being stuck on an ocean in seemingly completely perfect, tranquil, peaceful circumstances, that's quietly terrifying. Imagine, let me give you another parallel just really quick, because again, I feel this relates to hyperspace. Imagine if you're on a beautiful, gorgeous island, okay? And there is no land in sight. And you're stuck there. You're probably going to die. I mean, we might as well just be honest with you. No phone, no connection to the outside world. You're probably going to die. The heat out there can get much worse than most people think. You don't have access to actual potable water of any significant sort. And you don't have access to any real food. And you can't swim anywhere. I'm sorry, most people cannot swim miles in the ocean. I don't know if you've ever actually tried to go out swimming on, like, say, the beach, for example, where the waves are the strongest during a particular tide. An incoming tide, I forget what that's called off the top of my head. And you're trying to swim out, and you look up and you notice that you've actually basically lost ground because the water's pushing you more than you're capable of pushing against it. And yet, despite the fact that you are in this literally life-threatening situation, you're on a peaceful beach with the water lapping up against the shore, and there's maybe some wind whipping around through the coast. Just very peaceful, calm, quiet, non-threatening situation in which you're gonna frickin' die. Now, granted, hyperspace looks a lot less pleasant than that, but that's always the impression I've gotten about it throughout the whole series. We'll see more of this in the future too, so spoilers. It's this quiet place where you're not technically threatened any more than you are in regular space. I mean, obviously, if you're just in space, you're screwed too if you get lost. But hyperspace is much worse because there's no way to navigate other than by the beacons which people have already crafted. And you have a one in basically infinite chance of someone happening by you. Oh, that's another thing, by the way, I want to talk about. Don't let me forget about that. So I love the idea of the quiet terror of this episode. I had to think about it to really get it. I also love the idea of the drift. The idea that while there is gravitational, there is gravity. in hyperspace, and there are currents in hyperspace. So over time, a ship will drift further and further off course, and as it drifts, you literally have an exponentially increasing chance of it never being found again. And in fact, the idea that hyperspace ships getting lost in hyperspace basically stay lost in hyperspace is very logical. In truth, even in this episode, they got damned lucky to get the Cortez out. I mean, damned lucky. To be a little bit blunt, they probably shouldn't have. But then again, let's get back to this point really quick before I talk about the Cortez more, because there's a bit of contrivance in this episode. Two very big coincidental things happen. Technically three. First, the Cortez is rescued. The odds of them actually accomplishing this rescue are mathematically insignificant. And despite the fact that they're in a colossally huge space. I mean, okay, there's something that some people don't still really seem to understand, because science fiction doesn't really portray this as well as it should. Space is big, okay? Space is huge. In science fiction, you usually see a ship zooming by another ship to the point where the camera is at. You can see both ships right next to each other. But that's insane. Most ships, if you are a ship within hundreds of thousands of miles within the range of another ship, within scanning range, in other words, you are close to that other ship. You are practically brushing up against that other ship. That is insanely close by space standards. The odds of you accidentally being within the same region as a planet or a system are actually insanely small, and then you're insanely close because of the nature of it. Now, of course, naturally, you're going to be more likely to be near a planet or a system or a station because you deliberately went there or are coming from there or whatever. But you get my point. From a galactic... I mean, I don't know if you understand... Like, if you were to look at our solar system, trying to actually represent it, the amount of space in between the planets is, well, forgive me for the pun, astronomical. It's just empty, devoid space. That's ignoring the few thousand different planetoids that are orbiting around the sun within the Magellan Cloud that we don't even consider. Is it the Magellan Cloud? I may have just used the wrong term. I'm very tired. Forgive me. Before I continue embarrassing myself by saying the wrong thing, my point is the odds of a ship brushing basically up against another ship in space are approaching zero. There is simply too much space to be flying through. And yet, despite this fact, there's this weird object thing that just happens to brush up against one of the fighters and destroys it. And then ends up being the way for Lieutenant, I don't even remember his name because I don't like him, Mr. Hotshot Pilot, being the way for him to get home. The odds of that are, again, approaching zero. So, what I find myself wondering most when I look at that is this just an example of bad writing? Or is this something that is, shall we say, more deliberate? Is this a bit of foreshadowing? And I leave it for those of you who've seen the series to deliberate on this point. However, being completely honest, I think it's just the bad writing thing. I hate myself for saying that, but it's true. Let's talk about the Explorer ship really quick. They are very indicative of the era in which Babylon 5 is in terms of space exploration. There is still a frontier. That frontier is expanding. In fact, they pretty much name drop that in the episode. They talk about how we're going to the rim. Well, the new rim. In other words, the idea that they are still continuing to expand and explore and add more to what is known space, add more to the star charts. Basically, in Star Trek terms, this is the original series, where they were still out on the frontier, where there was still the unknown out there that they were still pressing out into. And the Explorer ships are a great way to demonstrate that in setting. I love the concept, by the way. I actually looked up something. Explorer ships are 3.75 times longer than an Imperial-class Star Destroyer. They don't really represent that well because graphics and issues. But think about that for a moment. Think about an Imp Star, and then think about an Explorer ship. Now, obviously, an Explorer ship would in no way be a match for the thing, but that's not the point I'm trying to get across. It makes sense that this is a city ship because it's meant to be out on the rim for years upon years on a time, dropping and building jump gates so other ships can then go to it, like I mentioned earlier. So that's logical. And I love the idea, and I love the romanticism of it, especially since, despite Maynard, being called out as lying, I have to agree with his statement. A lot of that kind of exploration is going to be dull as hell. Because, I hate to repeat this point, space is big. There's a lot of nothing out there. Even if you find a planet, the odds of that planet having anything interesting on it are not particularly high. There's a lot of planets out there. Excuse me, I've been very sick lately. So, I love the idea of the explorer ships. I love the fact that they are so expensive to use and move that they only have like a small handful of them. Sheridan gives a line about how most people, this is probably the only explorer ship they'll ever see. The reason for that is because explorer ships usually stay out on the rim. For example, let's say an explorer ship needs supplies, repairs, or to swap out crew. They'll drop a jump gate, send a shuttle through it back to wherever, and then the shuttle will swap people and then head back out to the explorer ship. They're meant to stay in deep space. They are deep space explorers. I actually found myself with a weird thought of what it would be like if... Shoot, hang on a second. God damn it. Oh, ow, that hurts. Oh. Sorry about that. I found myself wondering what it would be like if Voyager, rather than being this dinky little ship over on Star Trek Voyager, if it was this massive, deep space exploration vessel, like the Cortezes. I love the idea of that. I'm going to kind of start wrapping this up. So, I like the fact that Sheridan demonstrates his hatred of politicians in this episode. Just an absolute despising of them. That'll be relevant in the future, which is part of why I pointed out. But it also shows, even now, very clearly what kind of person he is. He's a military man. Granted, as I've said before, about half of my family comes from a bit of military background. And one thing that I have been raised to learn is that military people just think differently than political people. For example, the idea here that a politician will say, "Let's go to war!" And the general will say, "No, let's think about this. Let's try alternatives first." And in fiction, they usually portray that the opposite. In fiction, they usually portray the generals as the people who are like, "Rawr!" chomping at the bit to destroy everything. But in real life, most of the time, generals and admirals and whatnot are people who actually have crawled their way up through the rank and understand the cost, in terms of lives, for actually taking military action, and therefore are not inclined to do so simply to puff up someone's ego or for a political ploy. Hence, a lot of military men, and women of course, military people, I say man because I was referring to Sheridan, so a military man like Sheridan generally tends to have that kind of natural disdain for politicians. After all, politicians, in their opinion, aren't really qualified for their jobs. Excuse me, looking at my notes, looks like I only have 2 notes left. Both of them have to do with Delenn. So, the idea of the Minbari denying the authority of Delenn, that's a local Minbari, by the way, one of the ones on the station, and they're not really willing to treat Delenn as if she's still, the person of import and authority that she is, because they're not sure she's Minbari anymore. Now, that's not just racism, although there is a bit of that involved. This is a form of the elitist classism, the natural pride and arrogance that the Minbari show in general, and will be continuing to show in the future. If you don't understand what I mean, let me put it to you this way. The way the Minbari think is that what they acknowledge as correct is worthy of their attention, respect, etc. But if they do not acknowledge it as correct, then it is something that completely changes, even if it's the same person. The fact that they do not acknowledge that she is Delenn, even though she is Delenn, makes it natural in their minds to now question her authority, even though she's still the same person in every way that matters, and she is also someone who has a great deal of authority. Remember the incident with Sheridan back in Points of Departure. I think it was Points of Departure, where the Minbari is talking to him about a few things, and he says, Sheridan's asking him several questions, and the Minbari's response is, "I would answer your questions if I recognized your authority." Same exact concept here. The Minbari have a tremendous amount of pride, and only the things that they acknowledge will be recognized. My last point, well, I've debated about whether or not I want to put spoiler box on this one. I've decided not to. It's just a quote. But I just want to share that if you pay attention, Delenn has a wonderful quote about the right people being in the right place at the right time. It's the speech she gives to Sheridan to convince him to stay. And the speech she's been giving to herself, you can tell up here, to convince her that she should stay here, that she should keep doing this. I like that quote. And it's very indicative of her character arc and the way she's going to be going. And the last thing I would just want to say super quick here is that I like that they directly quote Carl Sagan here in this episode. I have a feeling that it was done deliberately. We know it was done deliberately. But I have a feeling that Carl Sagan would have found the living in the universe of Babylon 5 absolutely fascinating. I'm curious how he would get along with Delenn. Anyways, that's all I've got. Like I said, kind of just a dull episode to talk about. Hopefully I'll be better before I record for the next weeks, because I've been super sick the last several days. Regardless, I'll see you next time.